I'm here with Steve Magness, co-author of Peak Performance, which just came out this week.
Yeah, yesterday.
Yesterday. Well, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So, just a little background. So, how did you get to this book?
Yeah, it actually came out of my own frustration. So I was a really good prep high school runner. So I was the fastest runner in the nation for a high schooler in 2003, like sixth fastest all time.
Wow.
For American high schoolers, like
Wow.
number 3 or 4 in the world for. So I was really good.
Did you run short distance or long?
A mile.
Mile.
So I ran like professional meets in high school and stuff like that. And so at that point I thought like, all right, like my future is the Olympics and like that, and was dreaming big on that. And then I went off to college and like trained really hard, competed well, but saw my performance go backwards a bit. And eventually I just kind of ran myself into the ground and never ran faster than I did in high school.
Wow. Okay.
So now, you know, I coach and do some other things, but I work with some really elite runners, and my thought process has always been like, okay, like obviously to get to the best at whatever you have to do, you have to put in a lot of work. But is there a way to do it where it's sustainable, where you don't burn out, where you can last? And that's kind of been the focus point of my life, and that what brought about this book.
So for you, what was the issue? Was it you just burned out? Were you training too hard?
So what you see with really like driven people is I was kind of like obsessed about running. Like it was all that matters. Like I would run 120 miles per week when I was like 18, 19 years old, right? Which
That's
is
so much. I think cumulatively I've run 120 in my life.
Yeah. So it's like, you know, while going to school and all that stuff.
Right.
So you get really like driven.
Yeah.
And what I needed was someone to like point me in the right direction and almost hold the reins back. And I think I would have run much better, because what happened is like I just drove myself into like this physical fatigue that transmitted into this mental like burnout.
Right.
And that desire just kind of went away, and my body was just wrecked, and the immune system trashed and all this stuff. So just working too hard and not giving myself the chance to recover.
Right, you write about that a lot in the book, about the importance of rest, which is kind of counterintuitive.
It is.
Because you think, oh, my problem is that I'm too lazy. I'm not going and going and going. But in fact, there's a balance between how hardcore you go and how much you rest.
There is, and that's one of the things we really wanted to get across. Because the message out there is like, oh, just work really hard.
Yeah. Like
put your nose to the stone and just grind away. But what really happens, and regardless of whether this is athletics or life, or if you're a writer or intellect or whatever, is the same principle applies. And in the book we call it stress plus rest equals growth. So to get growth in an adaptation, whether physical or mental, you have to have that rest equation. Right. And the reason for that is pretty simple, is your body adapts when it has time to like come off of the stress or the stimulus. So it's not, for instance, we process the learning when we sleep, right? So if I, you know, from a non-athlete standard example, what I like to say is like, if I'm writing on this book and working really hard, and I have like a deadline, like the temptation is to be like, oh, I'm going to stay up until 2 a.m. until I get it done. Right. Well, the work suffers. It doesn't do very well. But if I step away at, you know, 11 o'clock and say, I don't have the answer to this conclusion on this, you know, paragraph or chapter, and then I go to sleep and I wake up refreshed the next morning, more often than not, like, it's just there. And I'm like, oh, this makes sense. Like, there it is.
And that flies in the face of this kind of creativity myth of this lone genius typing away until 5 in the morning, or, you know, or like a coder just coding until 9 a.m. So that apparently, well, I guess maybe it's just not sustainable. Like, you can do the occasional time.
You can go, I mean, you can go to the well for a bit, but it's not sustainable, and it doesn't work very well. And actually with creativity, it's really interesting, is there's a lot of research that shows that if you work like really deep at something, really diligent, and then step away and do something that is, you know, mildly distracting, like, you know, doing your dishes or vacuuming your apartment, or even going and taking a shower. Like, those are the moments where aha moments come in.
Or the shower.
The shower. And there's a reason that that's like, you know, a tale that's always told, because it happens. But there's actually legitimate science that shows that, like, stress the brain, back off, rest, and almost distract it with something else, and let your subconscious kind of process what you were working on, and then you'll get spit out this nice aha moment and have a creative.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, that's happened to me tons of times.
Exactly.
It's like your inspiration is this, like a cat, you have to ignore it.
Right.
And then it'll wander over, and you're like, oh, there you are.
Good example.
So it's interesting that this stuff works for both physical and psychological things. Because I would imagine, wrongly, that the body and the mind are different. Like they have different kinds of resilience.
Yeah, we have this kind of inbuilt idea, and it goes all the way back to like philosophy and the beginnings of psychology, of this like mind-body difference.
Yeah.
But the reality is, and what they're finding with the latest research is, there's just a very deep connection and interaction with it. So that like even, for example, even if you change your mindset on something, like it will change the hormonal response to it. So for example, with like how you see stress. So if I go in and I come into this interview here and I get all nervous and say, oh my gosh, like I don't know if I can do this, like I don't want to talk in front of everyone, or I see it as like, okay, I might have some anxiety, but that's going to be like a challenge and a good thing, because it's going to make me better. Then the hormonal response in terms of like cortisol will completely differ based on my mindset coming in.
Wow, okay. It reminds me a little of Kelly McGonigal's.
Yeah, exactly, very similar.
So how you frame I mean, it's classic in the sense of, do you see it as a challenge or as a threat?
Right, exactly.
But it must be hard, because when you've got something like that's sustained, I mean, like I think about like how long can you handle like a stressful situation before you just deteriorate?
Right, and that's true, and I think that's where that equation comes in. It's just balancing that thing. Like the harder and longer the stress is, like the other part of the equation has to counterbalance it. Like we have to be able to step back and step away. And it's really interesting that you see like taking prolonged vacations or frequent like just weekends where you step away from work. It benefits your work in the long term, and this might be an instance where like Europe, where they have longer extended stays, might be ahead of us. And it's funny, there was some really interesting research by one of the top consultancy groups, and they had, which they were working like 80, 90 hours a week, right?
The irony.
Yeah. But they said, all right, we're going to implement this plan, and they gave them like one like night off a week, where it's like you have to step away from that. And you're like, one night, like what difference?
Yeah, one night.
And everyone, like, it was funny reading the reports, because all the people were like, the workers were like, oh, I can't do that, like I'm gonna fall behind. They won't want to hire me and that stuff. But they forced them to do it, and their productivity and then their ratings by the companies they were working with went up after they were forced to just take one night off. And what it is it's just like, it gives that moment to breathe, and your body to recover, and your mind to almost like regain some willpower and strength, so you can go at it harder next time.
Right, and I think also as there's been a shift in industry towards more knowledge work, I mean, it made sense you could kind of like pull a lever and work in a factory for 8 hours with some diminished skill, but you know, if you're really relying on sort of cognitive and imaginative abilities, like how long can you do that for?
Exactly, and it's, you know, everyone gets like, if I go out for a run and exercise, like I'm going to get fatigued, and there's going to be a point where I'm like, I can't run anymore. Like I got to go sit on the couch, right? The same thing happens in the mind. Like the brain runs on glucose, the same thing your muscles do. And like that glucose and the blood oxygen going to it will decrease when you are mentally, like cognitively going after something for a while. And your performance will actually suffer. Until you like step back and just like you do with your body, is like let your mind kind of chill out and recover.
Were you surprised by any of the findings in the research? Like, I mean, I imagine you coach people, so you had a lot of anecdotal success, but something you thought, well, there's no way that's the way it is.
You know, I think as a coach, like you always think like you have these theories, right? And you're like, oh, this kind of makes sense. And most of the time, the science comes back and like justifies it, and you're like, oh gosh, I thought that was just like me, like my little gimmick or my little story. But I think what surprised me the most was probably the like how much we can influence that like mind-body connection. Like there was some really fascinating research by a guy who was one of the head researchers and coaches for the U.S. Olympic field hockey team. And he had this idea that he could manipulate almost like testosterone levels like acutely, like get a bump in like testosterone levels which are tied for performance in athletics. And he thought like, oh, I can do this by like priming them psychologically beforehand.
With what, images or words?
So you can do, he tried like videos and inspirational speeches and then like different things like having them do things that they liked beforehand, before a match, versus like a traditional like, oh, we're going to warm up and do this and get fired up. And it was really interesting. Like I asked him, okay, what works best? And he said, you give people the opportunity to do something they enjoy and their like levels go up. So if it's like someone who loves, for instance, on the athletic realm, someone who loves going out for like an easy jog, their testosterone levels will go up when they do an easy jog. But if they do something like short and fast, like sprints, and they don't enjoy it, they'll drop, and vice versa. So you have to like really go after something that like you enjoy, and the hormones will follow.
Right, that is surprising because it seems like a lot of ideas are you just grit your teeth and do the thing you hate. It's like medicine. Right?
Exactly.
But in fact, enjoyment is the key component.
It's key because like if you have this dread, then that furthers going and seeing it as a threat. Right. And that puts your body in almost like a fight or flight on the flight side, where you're like scared to do it, you have fear of failure, and the hormones kind of follow that. So like gritting your teeth while it's like, you know, glamorized is probably one of the worst things that you can do.
It's funny, I had a conversation with Angela Duckworth, who wrote a great book on grit, and one of her big points was that, you know, as a parent you think, oh, I'm going to force my kid to, you know, play piano every day or whatever. But in fact, if the kid doesn't like what they're doing, you're kind of wasting your time. Like you have to have some passion for it.
Right. You can't, they have to have a why.
You can't enforce grit and force...
Exactly. It's not something you can throw upon someone. And you see that in, like, coaching all the time with athletes. Like, all the parents think, like, oh, I'm going to make mine the next, like, NFL superstar or get him a college scholarship. And if the motivation is coming from the parent and not, like, intrinsically from the kid, like, they might see a little success a little bit because they're so scared of the parent, like they have that fear of failure. But then in the long term, they'll burn out and they won't reach that level because, you know, it's not sustainable.
So around the issue of motivation, you talked about the importance of purpose, right, and overriding ego. It's a whole section of the book. And what I'm curious about in that instance is it seems like so much achievement is driven precisely by ego. So how do you... If you override it, don't you get all zen and you don't care and then you stop running?
See, that's a big misconception people have. But what happens and what you see is like, and they've proven this in a lot of good research, is that when you have an overriding purpose, it actually boosts performance. Because think of it like this, okay? If you watch any sporting events like the NFL, the Super Bowl, NBA Finals, you know, the New York City Marathon, when they ask the winner of you know, the competition or whoever caught the winning touchdown, you ask them like, oh, how'd it go, what happened, like what motivated you? No one sits there and says, I want to thank myself and like all the stuff that I did to get here. Like very few people do that, right? Instead you hear like, I want to thank my family and everyone who sacrificed for me, or I want to give this up to God, or whatever it is. And that, if you have that as the motivating source behind you, what happens is your brain almost says like, oh, this is really important.
Right.
So we're not going to hold like the reins back. We're not going to make this person feel fatigued until later because this matters a whole heck of a lot.
Okay. I always thought they were just saying that.
You know?
Because you're supposed to.
You're supposed
why did
to.
you win? It's like, well, because I really wanted to stand here.
You know, and I'm sure some people do that, right? We're all human, like we all want to perceive like we're good people, right? But if you really dig down into it, and some of the really special moments, for instance, like when marathoner Meb Keflezighi won the Boston Marathon the year after the bombing, right? He had the names of the bomb victims on his bib and all those things, and there was, like, I'm a running coach, like his age, he was up there in age. He should have not won that race at all. Like, no possible way. But, you know, somehow he figured it out, and he had this extra motivation, being an immigrant and American citizen now. And it meant a lot to him. And I think in those genuine circumstances, like, it is a very potent performance enhancer.
Right. as a running coach, what do you find is the most common mistake people are making? Have you ever noticed that certain things are happening?
Yeah, too fast, too soon.
Okay, so what do you mean?
So what happens is, like, especially for beginners, or recreational runners, like, you get excited, maybe you sign up for your local 5K.
Sure.
You do it, you say, okay, this is a blast, and you go from like, well, the 5K isn't going to get me all my like Facebook, Instagram likes, so I need to go do the marathon.
Okay.
And it's just like, and it's great that they have those big goals, but they'll go from like 0 to 100 trying to get there. And that's why you see a lot of like these injuries and stress fractures and shin splints and whatever have it, is because they don't give their body that space to adapt to like the increased training load they're doing. So most of the time, again, people, when they're getting started, are really motivated and need to like take a step back and take the time for their body to get ready.
So if I were to start running, I should just, twice a week, 3 times a week?
Yeah, what I'd say is like, my favorite saying is like, don't go there until you need to go there.
Right.
So if you haven't run at all, like start with twice a week. Okay, once that starts to feel like comfortable, then you say, okay, like I need to make myself a little bit uncomfortable so I keep adapting. Not so much that I don't want to do this or get hurt, but just a little bit more. And in the book we call that just manageable challenge, but it applies to running. So it might be twice a week for a while and you get a hang of it, and it's like 3 times a week, and then maybe it's like, well, I'm going to increase the distance I go, and just a nice gradual incline.
And does that approach apply to creative pursuits? Say somebody starts learning to play piano. Should they not? Should they go practice an hour, 2 hours a day, or just like 20 minutes and kind of keep it steady?
Yeah, no, it applies to pretty much everything, because like the mind and body adapt in the same way. So learning occurs in the same way. Like you apply stimulus, whether that's physical in running or mental in terms of like learning the piano. Like it's a stimulus, and then like you give yourself time to adapt. If you go somewhere too soon, it's like throwing this huge stimulus at it, and then you'll adapt a little bit, but you can't like fully take advantage of all the adaptations.
Right.
So you've just like shot your bullet and like wasted it, and now to get better, like you have to increase that load somehow, and you're not going to go from like, all right, I'm playing the piano like 4 hours a day, like really hard, I'm going to go to like 6 hours. Like there's a limit, right?
And so one last question.
Sure.
Which is a lot of these examples that you've used were around like events, right? Like marathons,
right?
Or even creating something. What about like you just work in an office, right? Say I don't know, you're a consulting firm, or maybe not because those are long, but it's sort of like 9 to 5. So how does something like peak performance apply to just like a regular everyday routine? Yeah,
so it really applies, and what we kind of try to say is like, in this world, this genre, a lot of times what you see is people say like, oh, create a routine and do this exact thing. And what we kind of go for is like, there's no magic cure. There's no magic routine. There's no like, eat this at breakfast, do this before, bed, all that stuff. Like, it's very, very individual. And what we try and do is give the science and the stories behind that to create and show that. But one example I like to give for everyday office is like, you can boost A, your performance, and B, your enjoyment of it. If instead of like going from like getting there at 9 a.m. and then maybe you get a lunch break at 12 and then working until you're done, is if you take like mini breaks and break it up into like 30 minutes really hard, and then I'm going to step away for 2 or 3 minutes, and then another, and just repeat that pattern, your performance goes up, your enjoyment of it goes up too. And the reason for that is it's just like doing intervals on the track, right? So you have to have like this really stress, and then you step away, and it like rejuvenates you, and then you can come back at it instead of doing the grind. So that by like 3, 4 o'clock we're sitting on Facebook and just like looking at cat videos instead of doing work. So it's like figuring out how to prevent ourselves from like going into that trap.
Right, it's that 3 o'clock collapse.
Exactly.
It's like cookies, Facebook.
Yep, we've all been.
Perfunctory.
Yeah. There you
go. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Best of luck with the book.
Thank you very much.